Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Monday, the 24th of February in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll in Berlin, where Friedrich Merz is promising to form a coalition government by Easter as his Conservative alliance wins Germany's federal election. And as Olaf Scholz leads his party to its worst result since World War II, the far-right AfD gains enough support to become the country's main opposition.
In other news, 3 years since Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, two of Trump's top advisors declined to describe Russia as the aggressor. Plus, lessons in finance stretched UK parents tap home equity to pay surging private school fees. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The Conservative Friedrich Merz says he will form a new German government in less than 2 months after his election victory. His centre-right CDU-CSU alliance won almost 29% of the votes, according to the preliminary results. Merz says the country can't afford to wait for long coalition negotiations.
We, the CDU, and the CSU, the Union, we have won the 2025 federal election. The world out there will not wait for us, and it will not wait for lengthy coalition talks and negotiations either.
Merz now has to build that coalition, which typically takes weeks, if not months. His most likely option is the SPD party of outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz, which saw its worst performance since World War II, falling to third place. The other major winner was the far-right Alternative for Germany party. 1 in 5 voters chose the AfD, which has called for Germany to leave the euro, the deportation of migrants and lifting sanctions on Russia. Their Chancellor candidate, Alice Weidel, says the party is on course to become the largest at the next election.
We have doubled our votes. They wanted to cut us in half. The opposite has happened. And I must say one thing. Our hand will always remain outstretched for participation in government to implement the will of the people, the will of Germany. We are ready to participate in government.
Despite Weidel's party winning over 20% of the vote, the other parties have ruled out going into government with them because of their policies. Parts of the AfD, including 3 state chapters in the east of the country, have been classified by Germany's domestic security agency as extremist. The euro has strengthened in Asian trading by as much as 0.7% after the German election results. Markets see the outcome as paving the way for a pivot to increased government spending. Eric Nielsen, Chief Economics Advisor at UniCredit, says the likely coalition partners are all in favour of more investment.
Markets want them to revise the debt break period, right? And it's not just to spend more, it is to invest more. So we know the SPD and the Greens are in favour. We know that Merz and the CDU have opened up the idea, so it's going to come.
That's Eric Nielsen from UniCredit. Although the likely CDU-SPD coalition is being viewed favourably by markets, the far left and far right parties have enough seats to block any reform of Germany's constitutional debt break, which limits government borrowing.
Now, to other stories. Keir Starmer will join other world leaders on a call hosted by Kyiv today, 3 years on from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The meeting to discuss security guarantees comes after President Zelensky said that he would be ready to step down if it secured peace for his country.
If to achieve peace you really need me to give up my post, I'm ready. I can trade it for NATO if there are such conditions.
The comments come after US President Donald Trump described Zelensky as a dictator and called for Ukraine to hold elections as ties between the two countries sour. Meanwhile, 2 of President Trump's top advisors this weekend declined to describe Russia as the aggressor in the conflict as the administration seeks Vladimir Putin's support for a peace deal. Here's what US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told Fox News Sunday.
My question is, does all the finger pointing and pearl clutching make peace more likely? That's the enduring question the president is asking. He wants peace. And if that's the case, you've got to stare down the Russians and Vladimir Putin and who they've chosen to negotiate and have earnest conversations about difficult things, about security guarantees, about 2014 borders, what those will look like, about NATO members. Same thing with Ukraine. constructively and productively. So standing here and saying, you're good, you're bad, you're a dictator, you're not a dictator, you invaded, you didn't, it's not useful. It's not productive.
Hegseth's comments on Fox News Sunday were echoed by US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who also opted to not directly address the question when asked. Meanwhile, Ukraine's Zelensky says that the US has dropped its demand for Kyiv to commit to paying $500 billion as part of talks to give Washington a cut of the country's mineral wealth. Zelensky says a deal must be contingent on US military and security guarantees. Several US government agencies have advised employees to ignore a demand from Elon Musk's government efficiency team to justify their jobs by email or face dismissal. The agencies, including the Pentagon and Department of Justice, have cited potential legal pitfalls and agency autonomy in telling workers to pause on replying to the message. The email was also met with criticism from unions who call it cruel and disrespectful, vowing to challenge any dismissals resulting from the directive. As a new 20% tax on UK school fees takes hold, parents are going to extra lengths now to keep up. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
Families are tapping equity locked in their homes to meet the rising cost of British private education. Other lines of credit, including monthly instalment plans, are also growing in popularity as caregivers grapple with the new VAT charges introduced in the middle of the academic year. Seeking help from relatives or taking on more work is the first port of call for many families, but the number looking to remortgage or raise cash using other methods is soaring. Premium Credit, the largest lender of school-specific short-term plans, told Bloomberg the amount loaned in unsecured lines of credit rose 40% in January compared to the same period last year. The Labour government says it introduced the levy to finance investments in the state-funded education system. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
And those are our top stories for you this morning. On the markets right now, the euro is strengthening 0.5% against the US dollar. German stock futures are also up by 1%. This after the Conservative leader Friedrich Merz said he'll move quickly to form a new government after the elections. Asian stocks sliding after declines on Wall Street on Friday. The Hang Seng Index right now is down 0.7%, although Japan is closed for a holiday, so we have no cash treasuries trading until 7 a.m. Equities on Friday really fell into the close after a raft of weak US data. The S&P 500 fell 1.7%. The Nasdaq was down 2.1%. Bond surge. Yields on 10-year treasuries declined 8 basis points to 4.43. 10-year yields also declined 6 basis points on Friday. And we have another big test for this week in the AI space because we've got Nvidia earnings, which are out on Wednesday. So those are the latest figures when it comes to the markets. But in a moment, we're going to talk more about the Ukraine war 3 years on from the day of Russia's invasion. And also, of course, we want to bring you the latest from Berlin and what's been happening after the election last night. Stephen Carroll is there with us and he was out and about reporting last night on our Bloomberg television special after the election results and this morning. Stephen, very good to have you with us. Should we dig in? Friedrich Merz needs to build a coalition. He really only has one option, or explain the options that he's got.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the numbers, the preliminary results, and we won't have final results for a few weeks' time, so this is what is the basis of coalition building, have the CDU-CSU alliance led by Friedrich Merz with 208 seats. You need 316 for a majority in the new Bundestag. So if you add the 120 seats the SPD has, you get there with a 12-seat majority. So the math's pretty simple. Now, these are parties who have been in coalition before. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy to negotiate a deal between the two of them. But in the round of post-results interviews and debates that took place last night, the direction of travel was clear that they were willing to work together. Here is the outgoing finance minister, the SPD's Georg Kukis, speaking to Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta last night.
Well, it was a disaster in terms of the result, and the congratulations goes to the winner of the elections, the Christian Democrats. Friedrich Merz has the mandate now to form a government.
So clearly pointing to the fact that the SPD had a terrible night. I mean, this is a party that's been in power for most of the last 3 decades in Germany, a big shift in their support, but pointing to they're expecting Friedrich Merz to lead the next government and that you're leaving the door open for them to work together. Now, these parties, there will be points of friction over things like social welfare spending, migration, expected state financing to fund some of the massive outlays needed, particularly in defence as well. Timing is going to be very important here. Friedrich Merz says he wants this coalition to be formed quickly. He won't be negotiating with Olaf Scholz, by the way, the outgoing Chancellor. He said he's going to be focusing on his role as Chancellor until the new government is formed. It's other people in the SPD that'll pick up the baton there.
Meanwhile, of course, you were on election night at the event for the far-right AfD. The party saw its best ever performance. And this was also one point of why people were watching Germany so closely. I mean, it may be the Conservative Friedrich Merz is won the most seats, but actually the AfD coming in second.
Yeah, and I mean, look, it was a party atmosphere from long before the results were announced. There was sparkling wine on arrival, plenty of beer, and even a barbecue going outside at the AfD. This is a huge moment for a party that was only formed in 2013, 12 years ago. First designed to oppose membership of the euro, but evolving then into this hardline anti-immigration party that's now advocating for sanctions on Russia to be lifted. Alice Weidel, the Chancellor candidate from the AfD, pledged to overtake the CDU and CSU at the next election. And that's really part of the key message we had out of this party after this election win. It's interesting that they didn't quite reach the heights that some polls had ascribed to them. So there was a tiny element of disappointment when the first exit poll results were let out. But they're clearly going to be the biggest party in opposition. The firewall in German politics, where other parties refuse to deal with the AfD, remains in place. So that is part of the calculation going forward. The AfD will be the opposition. They have now the opportunity to advocate for their positions from that position. They'll be the chief critic for the government. Merz promising potential voters that as Chancellor he would introduce tighter controls on migrations. That just gives you an idea of some of the influence that the AfD policies have had on the election debate here in Germany as well. This is a huge moment, though, in post-war German politics. Remember, this is a party that 3 of their state chapters are classified as extremist. They're under surveillance by Germany's domestic intelligence service. The firewall for now remains intact, but Alice Weidel's message at their event last night is that they're looking ahead to the next election. And she did say they were open to overtures for government, but that's already been ruled out by the CDU.
Yeah, it seems quite reminiscent or brings to mind what's been happening in France, maybe Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella's party there too. In terms of the market reaction, the euro has strengthened on the back of this result. So it does seem to be that there's some investor relief. And do you think that's going to last?
I mean, look, there's a couple of questions in place here. The optimism on the markets that we're seeing comes from the fact that there is a coalition of mainstream parties possible, and the fact that it's 2 parties that are needed rather than 3, which was thought to be a likely option, seems more stable, and that's something that markets, of course, like. But let's not underestimate the challenges this next government is facing. There's been 2 years of economic contraction in Germany. We know about the demands for higher defence spending as well. Huge problems in the manufacturing industry here, still underperforming, and job cuts being announced by some of the major manufacturers. Then you have the risk of tariffs from the United States coming down the line as well. Now, economists have long been calling for a massive increase in public spending in Germany for things like updating infrastructure, helping the economy to modernise. These results don't translate, though, into an easy lifting of the debt brake, the constitutional provision that limits Germany's government borrowing. So the mainstream parties won less than 2/3 of the seats in the Bundestag, which means they're short of the votes needed to revise those limits, because the AfD and the Left Party, which also performed very strongly as well, Die Linke, have a combined 216 seats in the parliament. So they have over 1/3. Now, Friedrich Merz will have the option to temporarily lift some of these debt limits, as been done in crisis eras in the past. That doesn't change the long-term trajectory, though, too. And of course, add to this the timing issues. We know how quickly policy is emerging out of Washington, how much that could affect Germany. And talking about having a government in less than 2 months, for many people, feels like a very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's a very, very interesting moment, isn't it, Stephen? So good to have you with us this morning, live from Berlin, covering the election result. You know, perhaps the most important election result, certainly this year and in many decades for Germany. And on that point that you were making about the debt break and defence spending, let's move on to discuss, well, one of the issues that will be, you know, the first for the German government to need to grapple with. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky congratulated Friedrich Merz, saying that he looked forward to working with Germany to strengthen Europe after the election result last night. Zelensky said over the weekend also that he would give up his own presidency in exchange for Ukraine becoming a NATO member, whilst also pushing back against the Trump administration's demands for a minerals deal. Let's bring in our reporter covering Central and Eastern Europe, Piotr Skolimovsky, on this. Piotr, thank you so much for being with us. On the deal to exploit Ukraine's natural resources, Scott Bessent, he wrote in the FT this weekend, arguing that economic ties would provide a security shield for Ukraine. What do we know about this possible mineral deal?
Hi, indeed. So the deal has been in negotiations for several days now, several days and nights, as a matter of fact. It was first delivered by Scott Bessent in Kiev several weeks ago, and it was taken badly by the Ukrainian side. Basically, what it amounts to is that Trump administration has called for creating a kind of a fund worth around $500 billion, which in U.S. telling would allow Ukraine to pay off the assistance that U.S. has provided since the start of the war, and the revenue, the cut from the natural resources wealth of Ukraine will kind of accrue, and U.S. will be able to grab around 50% of it. It was criticized widely as sort of a colonial approach, and we also heard yesterday from President Zelensky, who obviously had a long press conference in Kiev. He pushed back against those demands. First of all, he pushed back against this idea of against the number, 500 billion. He says, well, actually the amount of aid is roughly around 100 billion and maybe less than that. And what he also said is that he won't allow for a deal that will have to be paid back for the next generations of Ukrainians. So, but the bottom line is the deal is in the talk, is in the making, but both sides are very much far apart on sort of finding a landing zone for it at this point.
Piotr, good morning. It's Stephen in Berlin. We've got another EU leaders summit happening this week. What should we expect to come out of that? Will European Union leaders be able to use Russia's seized assets?
Indeed, it's a flurry of activity. We actually already have foreign ministers meeting today. They called for also an emergency meeting yesterday. We heard from President Costa that an emergency summit is going to happen on March the 6th. I'm sorry. So the meeting today from foreign ministers is going to lay the groundwork for that. So as you mentioned, there is this, as we reported, there is this idea of a deal where it will be easier for EU to grab hold of or tap the frozen assets, Russian assets. It's almost 300 billion. At this point, what's happening is that EU can use just interest that accrues on those assets. At this point, the idea would be to use those assets as a collateral against future claims. So that's in the works. Separately, there's also a plan for 20 billion, which we also reported, and it's going probably to be announced today. 20 billion euros of extra aid for Ukraine. So as I said, there's a flurry of activity which will lay the groundwork for the summit next week.
Indeed. And meanwhile, we also expect this UN resolution today on peace in Ukraine. Russia may not be named as the aggressor. Does this cement the US's view on this conflict?
Yes, indeed. I mean, it was quite shocking and telling that two of President Trump's top advisors, Pete Hegseth and Mike Waltz, actually yesterday were asked to name Russia as an aggressor in the war, and they actually declined. And sort of this is reflected in the text of this UN resolution. So U.S. is pushing to block the resolution that would condemn Russia of the war of aggression, and the draft that they are proposing makes actually no reference to the principle of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, which is shocking for allies, and it kind of goes to show how this U.S. approach has shifted. I mean, under Biden, you could see that Zelensky had firm support of U.S., which is still remains the main supporter in terms of at least the military gear that's being sent to Ukraine. And we're seeing a clear shift in that, and that's obviously creates a room for Europe to step up, and that's why we also seeing so much action from Europeans. And one encouraging sign is probably what we heard from Friedrich Merz yesterday when he was speaking after the election in a round table with other leaders of the parties, where he said, well, we probably need to push for certain European independence because we're being pushed from one side by Russia, the other US. So let's see whether that happens. I mean, we need to first see the German government to be formed, but clearly there is a realization that the U.S. cannot no longer be taken for granted as a supporter of Ukraine in the future.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.